There is a kind of night in the mountains of Tennessee where the cold doesn't come from the air, but settles in your chest first before spreading outward. October of 1875 in Cane Creek Valley was full of nights like that, and on one of them, something began calling people by their names. What made this different from ordinary fear was the specificity of it all, because the voices didn't just call out into the void, they called in the right tone and used the right inflections, like when a woman heard her daughter's voice from the tree line at dusk, while that same daughter was standing right beside her in the kitchen. A man heard his brother shouting his childhood nickname from the dark, even though his brother was 3 rooms away and already fast asleep. These voices knew things that no stranger could, including private things, family shames, and conversations held in whispered confidence. They spoke names that no one but the dead should have known. The settlers didn't have a framework for what they were experiencing, as these were practical farmers who understood soil and loggers who could read the grain of timber. These families had learned to calculate survival by observing small changes in weather and animal behavior, so they weren't prone to sudden panic or rushing towards supernatural explanations. By October 10th, however, multiple families were documenting the same phenomenon in their journals, and even the Reverend was recording it in the church ledger. Something was calling people into the woods, and when they answered that call by stepping toward the voices of their loved ones, the forest swallowed them whole. By dawn on October 16th, 3 people were gone, and what the search parties found, or rather what they didn't find, changed everything the settlement understood about the place they called home. Cane Creek Valley in the 1870s was the kind of place where time moved differently, not slower exactly, but separated from the rest of the world. The settlement had grown for nearly 2 generations by 1875, which was long enough that the families there had stopped thinking about themselves as newcomers. They had learned the land's patterns and knew which hollows flooded in spring, where to plant their crops, and how to read the warning signs that the weather was shifting. The Hardens had been there for 40 years, and the Collinses even longer, while Reverend Pritchard had buried children in the cemetery only to later marry their siblings to other locals. These weren't transient people passing through, but were rooted deeply into the soil of the valley. The valley itself had a particular geography that shaped everything about the settlement, with ridges pressing in from both sides and forcing the community into a narrow strip alongside the creek. Sound traveled strangely in that space, so a voice from the upper hollow might seem like it came from the ridge right behind your house. Calls from the far end of the valley could sound like they originated just beyond your property line, but the settlers had learned to compensate for this over the decades. They understood how to read the landscape acoustically, and they knew the terrain well enough to navigate it in near total darkness without ever losing their way. But the autumn of 1875 brought something unusual to the valley that the oldest residents couldn't quite reconcile with their years of experience. The frost came early and stayed longer each night than it should have, and the animals began to behave erratically as the days grew shorter. Dogs refused to go into certain sections of the woods, horses tensed at things that weren't visible to the eye, and crows gathered in numbers that seemed excessive for the season. There was a quality to the air that wasn't quite wrongness, but a displacement, creating an unease that didn't attach itself to any single cause. The settlers had practical language for their world, talking mostly about crops and timber, or the births and deaths that defined their lives. There simply wasn't language for what they were feeling in October of 1875, because the land felt different, and the light coming through the valley didn't look the same. The first documented accounts appear in journals dated October 8th, written not as accusations or claims of the supernatural, but as careful observations of a changing world. These were notes about things heard and questions about whether their own ears could be trusted. The Reverend began recording accounts in the church ledger as testimony rather than proof, because these were people trained by necessity to observe accurately. They weren't seeking an explanation for the mystery, but were simply documenting an anomaly. Then came the night when the voices started, and they knew things they shouldn't have known. The Harden house sat alone on the eastern slope of the valley, tucked far enough away from the neighbors that they usually lived their lives without seeing another soul. Thomas Harden made his living as a logger, while his wife Margaret looked after the home and their 2 children, 16-year-old Daniel and 12-year-old Sarah. On the evening of October 8th, the family was just finishing up their supper when a voice drifted across the property and changed everything. It was Daniel's voice. This wasn't a scream or a desperate cry for help, but rather the sound of Daniel speaking in a perfectly normal tone. He was saying his mother's name just like he did when he wanted her attention for something small, and Margaret heard it clearly from the kitchen. When she turned toward the sound, she saw Daniel sitting right there at the table with his mouth closed and his hands busy with a piece of bread. The voice came again from outside the window near the tree line, calling her by her full name, Margaret, instead of Maggie. That was the name only one person had ever used for her, and that was her father, who had been dead for 11 years. Thomas walked over to the window, but the darkness outside was so thick that he couldn't see a single thing moving between the house and the woods. When he cracked the door open, a chill rolled in that didn't feel like a normal October night, but instead felt like something had been waiting on the porch and pressing against the wood. The voice didn't speak again right then, but 2 hours later it returned to call out for Daniel using his childhood nickname, Red. Only Margaret had ever called him that, and she hadn't used that name since he was a very small boy. Daniel stayed inside the house that night, and the rest of the family followed suit by locking the doors and staying away from the windows. The next morning, Thomas sat down and wrote about the event in his journal with the same cold detachment he used for tracking the weather or lost inventory. He noted that voices resembling deceased family members were heard at dusk, and he simply wrote that no rational explanation could be offered for what happened. This wasn't just happening to the Hardens, because on that same night, the Collins family 3 properties over reported the exact same thing. Their voices arrived at twilight as well, with a daughter calling her parents toward the dark woods and a son speaking from the trees in his exact tone and rhythm. The Prestons to the south heard the voices on October 9th, and by the 10th, nearly every family in the settlement had experienced at least one encounter. The pattern never changed, as the voices always showed up at dusk when the light was fading, but the true darkness hadn't quite taken over yet. They always came from the direction of the deep woods rather than the open meadows or the creek, and they used intimate names that only existed within the walls of a home. These weren't the formal names people used in town, but the private nicknames and shortened versions that only family members would know. Most troubling of all was the fact that these voices knew things that no stranger hiding in the woods could possibly understand. One woman reported hearing her mother's voice giving her specific instructions on a recipe, including details about measurements and timing that the mother had never shared while she was alive. Another man documented hearing his brother talk about a debt that no one else knew about, while a third record describes a voice repeating a private conversation between 2 children, word for word. Even though the children had been alone in an empty room when they spoke, the voice from the woods knew every syllable they had uttered. What made these moments so hard to handle wasn't the sound itself, but the sheer wrongness of hearing your mother's voice while she was standing right next to you. You would listen to your son's specific way of speaking coming out of the black woods while he sat directly in front of your face, and that sensory conflict was enough to make the mind break. Your ears told you one thing, while your eyes insisted on another, and the human brain isn't built to handle that kind of division for long. Several families talked about packing up and leaving that very night, but they quickly realized there was nowhere they could actually go to escape. The voices were already here, and whatever was calling out from the trees knew their names and the names of their dead. It seemed to understand the settlers better than they understood themselves, and while the voices were terrifying, what came out of the woods next was much worse. The figures didn't show up all at once, as the early reports from October 10th and 11th only mentioned the voices. By October 12th, however, the settlers began to see things in the shadows, and these sightings were recorded in the church ledger with the kind of shaky precision used by people who are afraid of forgetting the truth. The Reverend gathered these stories one by one, asking the witnesses for every tiny detail they could remember about what they had seen. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different witnesses, which makes it very hard to claim that everyone was just having the same hallucination. People described the figures as gaunt, but they didn't look like a person who was starving or thin from lack of food. They looked gaunt, in the way a thing looks when it has never actually fit inside its own skin, with the flesh hanging loose around the face and the hands. One person said the skin looked like old parchment stretched over a frame of wood, while another noted that the faces lacked the bone structure that makes a human being recognizable. The journals also go into great detail about the clothing these things wore, noting that the fabric was stiff, as if it had been soaked in something and left to harden. A white coating that looked like flour dust clung to the material and wouldn't brush off, and the clothes hung on the figures like they were draped over a rack. When these things moved, the clothing stayed rigid and didn't flow with the body, making it look like the figure inside was completely separate from what it was wearing. One settler spent several minutes watching a figure during a brief moment of moonlight, and he wrote down exactly how the right shoulder sat much higher than the left. He described how the arms hung at angles that would be incredibly painful for a human, and he saw that the head sat off-center on the neck in a way that looked broken. Despite all these physical errors, he still felt a wave of recognition because there was something about the shape that reminded him of someone he used to know. This feeling of recognition shows up in almost every account, with settlers reporting that the figures looked like rough approximations of people who had passed away. They weren't perfect copies, but rather looked like something had tried to rebuild a person using only half the information it needed. The proportions were wrong and the details were fuzzy, but the general size and the color of the clothes were enough to tell the settlers exactly who the figures were supposed to be. The way these things moved was just as strange as how they looked, because they didn't actually walk like a person does. Instead, they seemed to move and stay still at the same time, jerking forward in sudden bursts after standing perfectly motionless for a long period. One account says it looked like time was jumping forward, with the figure suddenly appearing several feet ahead of where it had been a second before. Other people watched them stand still for hours in the moonlight before they simply vanished back into the shadows without a sound. The most chilling detail that everyone agreed on was the overwhelming sense of emptiness that these figures gave off. Multiple people who had never spoken to each other used that exact word, empty, to describe what they felt when they looked at the things in the woods. They didn't feel like they were possessed by demons or even particularly evil, but rather like something essential had been scooped out of them. One man wrote that they looked like the shape of a person, with everything that makes a human being real completely removed. The church records from November of 1875 include a strange entry about 3 different settlers who saw these figures during what the Reverend called magnesium flash moments. These were sudden bursts of intense light that lasted only a few seconds, and in those moments, the figures looked more solid and real than they ever had before. The light revealed the same crooked shoulders and the same dusty, stiff clothing that everyone else had seen, confirming that these weren't just tricks of the dark. These stories are credible because they are so specific and because so many different people saw the exact same things. These weren't tall tales told for entertainment, but were the observations of farmers and loggers who spent their lives looking at the world with a practical eye. These men knew the shape of the woods and the way a human body is supposed to move, and when they all started reporting the same impossible details, the community knew the danger was real. The only question left was what these hollow things actually wanted from them. The voices didn't simply repeat what they had overheard, and that distinction is where the real horror begins. Early attempts to explain away the phenomenon focused on the idea that these entities were just mimicking sounds, like a parrot capturing voices or information it picked up by being nearby. But the accounts from those who survived revealed something far more deliberate and chilling. These entities weren't just playing back recordings of the dead. They were constructing original conversations and thinking through their words. One of the clearest examples comes from the testimony of James Hartwell, a settler who lived northwest of the main village. On October 11th, Hartwell heard his father's voice calling out from the thick woods, even though his father had been dead for 3 years. The voice didn't just shout a name to get his attention. It addressed a specific conflict that had existed between them, a bitter disagreement about land that they never resolved before the old man passed away. The voice offered concessions and acknowledged James's side of the argument. It even tried to make peace by using phrases his father used to say, capturing the particular way the man had spoken in life. What made this different from simple mimicry was how the conversation progressed over time. The voice didn't just repeat a single message like a broken record. When James moved closer to respond, the voice adapted its tone and shifted its approach to keep him engaged. When James showed hesitation, the voice offered different arguments to pull him in. When James seemed about to turn away and go back to the house, the voice called him by the nickname his father only used in moments of deep tenderness. The entity wasn't just pulling stored information out of a library, it was engaging in a real-time negotiation with a living man's soul. Another documented case involves Elizabeth Collins, who heard her sister's voice on the night of October 12th. Her sister had died of consumption 2 years prior, but the voice that came from the dark did more than just replicate her sister's soft tone. It referenced a secret that the two sisters had never told another living soul, a moment of shame they had shared in confidence during their very last conversation. More disturbing was the fact that the voice used that secret as leverage to get what it wanted. It bargained with Elizabeth and promised to explain how it knew these things if she would only step into the woods. It offered her answers about death and what comes after, hinting that her sister was somehow present inside this voice. The psychological architecture of this mimicry becomes very clear when you look at these accounts together. These entities didn't operate on crude or simple principles. They seem to have a deep understanding of human attachment and how grief makes a person vulnerable to suggestion. They recognize the specific pressure points in every relationship, whether it was an unresolved fight, a shared secret, or a loss that still felt like an open wound. Once they found that weakness, they weaponized that knowledge systematically to lure people away from safety. The pattern of escalation found in the records suggests that these things were learning as they went. Early encounters on October 8th and 9th only involved voices calling out names or repeating general knowledge. By October 12th and 13th, the entities were employing specific emotional tactics and personalizing their approach to every victim they targeted. They were demonstrating an understanding of human psychology that went far beyond facts. They were studying us. One account from a survivor named Samuel Price, who heard his dead wife calling but managed to turn away, describes the exact moment of recognition. He said it was an instant of perfect clarity where he stood on the line between belief and disbelief. He was listening to his wife's voice offer him knowledge that seemed to come from a genuine memory, but then he noticed a tiny flaw. The voice wasn't quite using her particular way of pronouncing one specific word, and while it was close enough that he almost missed it, it was still wrong. It wasn't that the voice was unrecognizable, but rather that it felt like something was performing a role instead of actually being the person. It was a sophisticated performance, but it wasn't perfect. Price noted in his testimony that once he recognized the performance for what it was, the voice changed instantly. It stopped trying to seduce him with memories of his wife and began to scream. It used every emotional manipulation it could generate, and when that failed, it stopped using his wife's voice entirely. The sound became something else that was stripped of any human reference. It was just the entity in its raw form, calling him into the dark with a sound he couldn't describe. Understanding what the entities were doing didn't actually protect the people in the settlement. In many ways, that knowledge only made the fear more intense. But understanding their methods didn't stop the entities from moving forward. It only made the next phase of the haunting much worse. By October 15th, the people in the settlement had stopped trying to document what was happening because fear had completely replaced their curiosity. Families began barring their doors and sitting up through the night in large groups, taking turns watching the windows for any sign of movement. Several families had already packed their wagons and fled the area. The Reverend had written a letter to the county clerk asking for an official investigation, but nothing ever came of it. The region was just too vast, and the resources were too thin to help a small village. Besides, the stories sounded impossible when they were told secondhand to people who weren't there. That night arrived with a biting cold that several survivors mentioned in their journals. The air felt heavy, as if it were pressing inward on the houses. The animals in the settlement began making sounds they didn't normally make, with cattle lowing in distress and pigs becoming strangely agitated in their pens. Around midnight, all the roosting birds took flight at the exact same time. At 13 minutes before midnight, according to the journal of Thomas Harden, the voices began calling out from everywhere at once. This was the critical difference that changed everything for the settlers. Previous nights had featured isolated incidents where voices called at a single property or figures appeared to one specific family. October 15th brought simultaneous encounters across the entire settlement at the same time. 11 separate households reported hearing voices at nearly identical moments. Families who had remained skeptical and tried to rationalize the earlier incidents now heard things they couldn't explain away. The voices didn't just call out from the trees this time. They moved around the houses and circled the properties. They called from multiple directions at once, with a father's voice coming from the east window and a mother's voice from the west, while a child's voice cried out from directly outside the bedroom. All of them were speaking at once and using names that belonged to people who were actually standing right there in the room. The figures also appeared much closer to the houses than they had ever been seen before. One account describes a figure standing within 20 feet of a home, visible in profile against the lighter darkness of the fields beyond. Another settler reported seeing 3 figures at the same time, positioned at different points around his property and moving with that same jerking, broken gait they had shown in earlier encounters. The disappearances happened in the early morning hours between 1 and 2:30 a.m. Thomas Hartwell was the first to vanish. His wife testified that he left their home to investigate a strange noise he heard near the barn. He was armed and seemed very deliberate about going out there. She watched him walk as far as the property line, but he never came back. The search party that went out at first light found disturbed ground near the eastern wall of the barn, which looked like a circular depression about 3 feet across where the soil had been recently turned. His rifle was found 50 yards to the northeast, and it had been fired once. There was no other trace of him left behind. Margaret Collinsworth disappeared sometime between 1:15 and 2 in the morning. Her daughter heard Margaret leave the house in response to what she described as her father's voice being very insistent. The problem was that Margaret's father had been dead for 5 years. The searchers eventually found a piece of Margaret's nightgown torn and caught on some brush near the creek bed about 40 yards from the house. The fabric was soaking wet, but no one could determine if it was from the creek water or something else entirely. The third disappearance was the one documented most carefully because the victim was Robert Hayes. He was the settlement's blacksmith and a man of incredible physical size and strength. Multiple witnesses saw him leave his home around 2:15 in the morning carrying a heavy axe. He was chasing a figure that was standing in the moonlight about 50 yards from his property line. Hayes walked toward it with clear intent to fight. The figure didn't run away. It simply stood there and waited for him. Witnesses reported that as Hayes got closer, the figure seemed to grow much larger, or perhaps the way Hayes saw its size began to change. The descriptions get very blurry at this point. One observer said Hayes stopped about 15 feet away from the figure, while another insisted he actually made contact with it. But everyone agreed on what happened next. The sound was what stayed with them the most. Multiple accounts mention it, and while some described it as a kind of vocalization, it wasn't a scream. The sound was described as a kind of wrongness made audible, like a collision between frequencies that the human ear isn't meant to process at the same time. Several people had an immediate physical reaction to the noise. They suffered from nosebleeds and their ears rang with a high-pitched tone that lasted for days. Some even felt like their sense of where they were standing was being disrupted. When the sound finally stopped, the figure was gone and Hayes was gone with it. The search party found his axe 23 yards from where he had been standing, and it was buried halfway into the soft soil. The blade was wet, but there was no blood visible anywhere on the ground. By the time the sun came up on October 16th, 3 people had been taken from the settlement. The way the people responded shifted fundamentally after that night. This was no longer a strange event to observe and write down in a journal. This was a siege. What happened next revealed something about the Hollow Men that changed the way the survivors saw the world forever. In the weeks following those first disappearances, the mood in the settlement shifted from private fear to a kind of desperate collective analysis. Neighbors who had spent years keeping to themselves suddenly started comparing notes over fence lines and kitchen tables. Reverend Pritchard began organizing meetings where families could lay out exactly what they had seen and heard, hoping to find some shred of logic in the chaos. What they found wasn't comforting. The stories didn't describe a series of random tragedies, but rather a systematic behavior that suggested these entities were following a specific set of rules. Geography was the first pattern to emerge from those hushed conversations. The voices and the tall, pale figures weren't wandering the valley at random, but instead seemed to haunt very specific patches of ground. The Hartwell property, where the first person had vanished into the night, sat directly above a stretch of land the locals called the Old Hollow. The Collinsworth family lived within sight of a jagged ravine where a homestead had burned to the ground decades earlier, and the Hayes property bordered a territory that settlers had always avoided for reasons no one could quite put into words. When the locations were finally mapped out, the clusters were undeniable, showing that the entities were anchored to particular corners of the landscape. The settlers naturally began to ask why these specific places drew such darkness, and the answers surfaced slowly through old journals and long-forgotten stories. Every one of these locations shared a history of trauma or death. The Old Hollow above the Hartwell land hadn't been an official cemetery with headstones and records, but it had served as a burial ground where people were put into the earth quickly and quietly during hard times. The ravine near the Collinsworth place had claimed several lives over the years, and the Hayes property sat next to a site where an entire family had died of fever in the 1850s, their bodies buried in a single unmarked grave during the panic. This wasn't new information to the people living there, as it lived in the collective memory of the valley in the way local lore always does. No one had ever bothered to document where the graves lay or put up markers to warn outsiders. But the locals knew exactly which hollows to avoid when hunting. They knew which sections of the forest were off-limits for cutting wood, and that knowledge had been passed down through generations of living on that rugged land. Now, the connection was impossible to ignore, and it became clear that these entities weren't just wandering spirits, but were physically tied to the places where the dead rested. Search parties eventually began looking for what they called the pits. In the areas where the hollow men were seen most often, men found strange, circular depressions in the dirt that were clearly not natural formations. These were hand-dug holes, some of them old and covered in moss, while others showed signs of fresh, dark earth being turned over recently. A few of these pits contained bone fragments that the searchers refused to look at too closely, and one hole near the ravine where Collinsworth disappeared held scraps of fabric that matched the clothing styles from the era of the unmarked graves. The pits were never deep, looking less like someone had burrowed down and more like something had been pulled upward from the soil. The realization that came before all of this was even darker than the pits themselves. When the settlers started poking around the sites most often linked to the entities, they found that the ground had been disturbed across multiple locations. This wasn't just recent digging, as some of the sites showed signs of being worked and turned over years prior, but the pattern held firm. Every time the soil was opened or the earth was moved, the number of encounters in that area spiked. One family recorded this phenomenon directly in their own records. They had spotted a section of the forest behind their cabin where the dirt looked freshly turned, and within 3 nights, the activity at their home became unbearable. The voices in the woods grew louder and more insistent, and the pale figures began appearing much closer to their windows than ever before. When they told their neighbors about the digging, the same story came back from other households, confirming that wherever the ground was disturbed, the entities responded with a terrifying new energy. The settlers eventually formed a theory they were too afraid to speak aloud, though it shows up constantly in their private letters and diaries. They believed these things were connected to the dead, but not in the way a typical ghost story functions. It was something more physical and fundamental, as if the entities were sustained by the burial sites and anchored to the remains within. When those sites were touched or the dead were exposed to the air, the entities reacted with a focused aggression that felt like a defense of their territory. But the most disturbing pattern of all didn't appear until the settlers began looking at their accounts over the span of several months. The church ledger kept by Reverend Pritchard is still tucked away in the Tennessee State Archives today. The handwriting is tight and methodical, showing the work of a man who was trained to observe the world without letting his emotions get in the way. He didn't use flowery language or jump to wild conclusions, but instead recorded what he heard and verified what he could to keep a sober record of the events. His entries from October of 1875 through February of 1876 are the only official documents we have of what actually happened in that valley. The county clerk's office kept its own set of books during that time, including property assessments and letters sent to the territorial government. In the months following October 15th, those records show a very clear and very sudden trend. Families were leaving the valley, but they weren't fleeing in a panicked mob. The departure was quiet and businesslike, with people selling off their land at a massive loss or simply walking away from their homes entirely. The official reasons listed on the deeds were always the same: citing better opportunities out west or health issues, which was a polite way to preserve their dignity while they ran for their lives. The private letters from that winter tell the story the official records were too scared to mention. Letters saved by descendants and donated to libraries reveal the raw fear that people couldn't put into a government document. One man writing to his brother in Virginia said plainly that the land was no longer fit for Christian people because the ground itself seemed to reject their presence. Another letter from a widow stated that she couldn't stay in a place where the forest no longer sounded like the wilderness, but instead sounded like something that possessed a memory. These were not people who were easily spooked by shadows, but they had experienced something that broke their resolve. You can see the collapse of the community in the census numbers from that era. The settlement had grown to about 230 people by the middle of 1875, but by the end of the following year, fewer than 140 remained. The exodus picked up speed through the late autumn, and while the migration finally leveled off by the spring of 1876, the town never truly recovered. The only people who stayed behind were those with the deepest roots in the soil, or those who simply had nowhere else to go and hoped they could survive what their neighbors couldn't. Other settlements to the north and east began reporting their own strange occurrences in the following months. People spoke of voices in the autumn dark and figures moving through the trees, but those accounts are much thinner and less detailed than the ones from Cane Creek. Word of what had happened in the valley had spread through the hills, and people became much more guarded about what they were willing to say out loud. The openness that Reverend Pritchard had encouraged was replaced by a heavy silence, and as families stopped reporting what they saw, the church stopped writing it down. The most striking thing about the historical record is how abruptly the documentation just stops. The very last entry in the Reverend's ledger is dated February 14, 1876, and it is hauntingly brief. He wrote that no further incidents had been reported and that the matter could be considered resolved, but he never explained why he felt the situation was over. No other accounts from the time suggest the phenomena just vanished, and for generations, families continued to avoid the old hollow and the ravines, as if the danger was still very much alive. It is likely that keeping records simply became too much of a liability for the people who stayed. Families who kept talking about the entities were labeled as unstable, and there was no way to explain these events to the rational world outside the mountains. Silence became a way to protect your reputation and your standing in the community, so if you didn't talk about it and you didn't write it down, you could pretend it wasn't happening. Fragmented accounts from 1876 and 1877 show that similar entities were being seen across the Appalachian territories. The descriptions were always the same, involving voices and figures that seemed to know things they shouldn't, but the records are incomplete and scattered. Once the weight of public skepticism became too heavy to bear, few people were willing to risk their names by preserving the truth. The question that has always bothered historians isn't whether something happened in that valley, because the loss of property and the sudden drop in population prove that a tragedy occurred. The real mystery is why the records went silent and why the entities seemingly retreated back into the earth. The moment silence fell over the documentation, the rational world moved in with explanations. Experts writing from distant cities, men with credentials who had never set foot in the valley, offered theories about mass hysteria and the suggestibility of rural life. They claimed that people cut off from broader society, facing economic hardship and the grinding pressure of the frontier, simply developed shared delusions. In their view, these settlers saw what they expected to see and heard what grief had primed them to hear. It wasn't something supernatural to them, but rather the human mind under duress manufacturing its own horror. The misidentification theory followed closely behind, as these experts argued that the settlement had encountered natural phenomena and attributed supernatural meaning to it. They pointed toward animal sounds distorted by the valley's acoustic properties, or perhaps vagrant individuals who had wandered into the territory. Optical illusions created by moonlight and exhaustion were blamed for the sightings because the wilderness is full of things that frighten settlers. Fear escalates perception until a shadow becomes a figure and a wind becomes a voice, turning mistaken identity into proof of the impossible. Folklore contamination offered another framework for those looking to dismiss the accounts. The region had inherited deep Appalachian traditions and stories passed down about entities in the woods, like skinwalkers or other conjured things. This collective knowledge provided a template so that when people experienced something genuinely unexplainable, they fitted into the cultural narrative already available to them. The phenomenon didn't create the story, but rather the story created the phenomenon, meaning people were seeing exactly what their tradition had taught them to expect. These explanations satisfied people who weren't there because they created distance and made the events manageable. They turned the terror into something comprehensible and safely part of the past, but these explanations fracture when you hold them against the actual accounts. The specificity of the documentation resists simple hysteria because hysteria is usually general and vague. Fear makes people see threats everywhere, but the Cane Creek accounts are hauntingly precise. Specific voices call specific names, with information only the family would know, and multiple independent observers describe identical asymmetries in clothing patterns. Hysteria produces variation, where each panicked mind generates its own imagery, but the convergence of detail across these accounts doesn't match how collective delusion actually manifests. It matches something else entirely. The misidentification theory encounters an even harder problem when you look at the physical evidence left behind. There are the pits near burial sites, the cloth fragments, the disturbed ground, and Hartwell's rifle found lying in the brush. Hayes's axe was found partially buried in the dirt, and these aren't hallucinations. They are tangible objects and traces. Searchers found them and documented them, and they remain as evidence that you can't misidentify a piece of clothing from someone who vanished. You can't mistake a depression in the soil for something other than what it is. The psychological explanation carries more weight because grief and isolation are very real forces. The frontier created genuine hardship where people lost loved ones suddenly and finally, and the valley did separate families from the broader community. All of this creates a vulnerability that makes people susceptible to shifts in perception. A woman who lost her sister might genuinely hear her sister's voice more readily than someone living in a city surrounded by distraction, and that part of the theory isn't wrong. But it doesn't account for the pattern of how these things happened. Grief appears individually, and isolation produces unique responses. Yet the phenomena in the valley seem to synchronize. Multiple families heard voices on identical nights, and figures appeared to different households at the exact same time. The voices escalated their tactics in a parallel fashion, and the activity always increased following any disturbance to the burial sites. This isn't the messy work of grief, but rather something responding to a stimulus and coordinating its efforts. The survivors who managed to avoid being taken left accounts that resist any of these academic frameworks. They described the moment of recognition, which wasn't the moment they understood the phenomenon was supernatural, but the moment they understood they were being hunted. One man documented the instant he realized the voice replicating his wife wasn't drawing on a genuine memory, but was instead executing a cold approximation. Another survivor described a sensory wrongness that preceded any rational understanding, as if his body recognized the threat before his mind could even find the words. The skin on his neck went cold, and his breathing changed because some part of him understood that what was calling him occupied a category of thing that human language doesn't have a name for. These aren't delusions, because delusions don't inspire this kind of precise observation or produce this quality of testimony. Survivors don't report being confused about whether they had experienced something or not. They report being entirely clear about experiencing something fundamentally alien, and they spent the rest of their lives struggling to find language adequate to describe it. No single explanation accounts for all the documented phenomena, and the evidence resists any easy categorization. What remained was a mystery that the settlement never fully resolved. The legend moved into oral tradition the way stories do in places where writing isn't always trusted. Descendants repeated what their grandparents had witnessed, and while the account changed shape as some versions added elements and others simplified, the core persisted. Something lived in the forest that knew the dead, and it called to the living by using what it had learned about their grief. The region's folklore eventually absorbed the Hollow Men into its broader catalog of things you should never meet alone. Similar entities appeared in stories from other valleys, with patterns of recognition repeating across the territories where figures approximated the dead and voices knew things they shouldn't. Modern researchers document what remains today, including the emptied settlement, the avoided hollows, and the protective practices that emerged to guard against a return. 3 people vanished into the brush, and the families who stayed behind watched their settlement wither away until the voices finally stopped. Even though the town never healed, survivors always spoke of a heavy feeling that followed them through the hollows, a sensation of being watched that their descendants still claim to feel today. If you want to hear more accounts from the regions where these encounters never truly ended, make sure to subscribe.